Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of 3 webinars, which are hosted jointly by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw. The title of the series is World War II, Witnesses and Memory, and we will be focusing on the experiences and testimonies of those who witnessed the outbreak of the Second World War, the occupation of much of Europe by Nazi Germany, and its liberation by the Allies, as well as on how institutions and scholars preserve and teach this history. Speaking as we are, one day after the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army, which occurred on the 27th of January, 1945, and which we now observe as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the subject of today's discussion will be Liberators and Liberated. With me today are 3 distinguished panelists. Dr. Gordon Nick Mueller is president of and CEO emeritus of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which he co-founded. He has played leading roles in the museum's organization, development, image, and outreach. Before that, he enjoyed a 33-year career as professor of European history at the University of New Orleans, during which time he also served as dean, vice chancellor, and founding president of the Research and Technology Park. He was involved in many initiatives at the university, including founding the university's international study programs, which have sent over 10,000 students to 10 countries for study abroad since 1973. With us also is Dr. Robert Citino, who is executive director of the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy and the Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian at the National World War II Museum. Dr. Citino is an award-winning military historian and scholar who has published 10 books, including The Wehrmacht Retreats, Fighting a Lost War, 1943, Death of the Wehrmacht, The German Campaigns of 1942, and The German Way of War, From the 30 Years' War to the Third Reich. He has written numerous articles, as well as contributing regularly to general readership magazines, and he has taught, among other places, at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and the U.S. Army War College. Joining us here in Warsaw is Dr. Wojciech Kozlowski, who is the director of the Pilecki Institute, a research institution based in Warsaw devoted to the study of the Nazi and Soviet totalitarianisms and to their effect on Polish society. He has spearheaded its many programs, which cover a broad range of archival, research, exhibitional, educational, and cultural initiatives, and he is the chief editor of its scholarly journal, Totalitarian and 20th Century Studies. He holds a PhD in medieval studies from the Central European University and an MA in history from the University of Warsaw. He was a fellow at the New Europe College and a visiting scholar at the Department of History at Harvard. My name is John Cornell. I am a historian here at the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw, and it is my great pleasure to be moderating this evening's discussion. We are going to begin by viewing several short video clips showing testimonies both of people liberated from Nazi camps and of those who liberated them. We'll begin with a clip from the Polish side, which will be followed by a brief commentary from Dr. Kozlowski to provide some historical context. This will be followed by 2 brief clips with testimonies concerning the liberation of German camps by American soldiers, which will be followed by commentary from Dr. Citino and Dr. Mueller. This will then serve as our starting point for the roundtable discussion, which will be the main focus of our webinar. Hopefully there will be some time at the end of our discussion as well for questions from the audience. So I invite you all, please, to feel free to use the Q&A button on the bottom of your window to ask questions. Let us begin then with the first of the clips.
Chyba parę godzin czekaliśmy, aż całkiem ucichła strzała i blady wybiegł przyniosła cała autostrada przy barakach. Wybiegł do tej autostrady, patrzy, a spod lasu czołgi jadą. I przybiegł przerażony, Niemcy wracają, a to byli Amerykanie. A ja podbiegam, patrzę, białe gwiazdy są na tych czołgach. Ja mówię, Rysiek, to nie Niemcy, tylko Amerykanie, bo białe gwiazdy. No i wtedy wszystka dzieciarnia, tam było 5000 osób w tym obozie. Wtedy dzieci niektórych rodzin z nami biegły. Dzieci, młodzi i biegniemy tam naprzeciw tych czołgów. A ja z bratem trzymam się za ręce, piersi. Pierwszy czołg zatrzymał się, a to był jakiś oficer dowodzący. I mówi do mego brata, no to siadaj, to wjedziemy do waszego obozu razem. A brat mówi, nie mogę, bo ta dziewczynka musi ze mną wsiąść. I zaciągnęli mnie na ten czołg i wjeżdżamy z bratem pod obóz. Oni kazali tam bramy otworzyć, tych strażników przepędzili. No i myśmy wysiedli. Mówię, a teraz na pewno głodni jesteście. A na końcu tego całego łańcucha czołgów były wagony z żywnością. I tam było wszystko. I kiełbasa suszona, i szynka, i chleb biały amerykański, i jajka, ser, wszystko było. I nawet czekoladki, i ciastka dobre. Więc możecie wszystko jeść i sobie zabierać tam do bagażu, co chcecie. I myśmy, brat czapkę zjął, jakieś tam czekoladki, ciasteczka. Ja też do kieszeni, pomarańcze, tam jeszcze bułeczki, coś. No i oni mówią, idźcie i zaraz wracacie, to jeszcze sobie weźmiecie stąd. Rodzice zadowoleni, bo wreszcie wszyscy się najedli. I tam ci wszyscy, którzy z nami uciekali, zaczęli zapisywać, gdzie kto chce jechać po wojnie. Czy kto chce tam zostać, czy wyjeżdżać. No i ja i brat krzyczeliśmy, że my chcemy do Ameryki. My do Nowego Jorku, do Ameryki. No i zapisali nas tak. I myśmy tam czekali. No to trzeba było ze 2 lata czekać. Czekaliśmy na ten Nowy Jork, a ja się w międzyczasie tam zapisałam do szkoły. Do takiej szkoły polskiej, ale gdzie uczyli po angielsku. No i tam obiady dostawaliśmy, było bardzo fajnie. No ale myśmy chcieli do Ameryki. W końcu ojciec dowiedział się, że jest takie zebranie. Polscy oficerowie przyjechali tu na to zebranie i będą to zebranie prowadzić i chcą z Polakami porozmawiać. I ojciec poszedł na to zebranie. Właściwie brat i ojciec poszedł na to zebranie. No i ci Polacy, taki pan Chlebowski, pułkownik Chlebowski z Krakowa, namawia ojca. A ojciec nie mówił, że był legionistą. Już od razu by tu zamknęli. Słuchajcie, dostaniecie mieszkanie za darmo. Pan świetną posadę zostanie. Ojciec też nie mówił, gdzie pracował. A pracował w wywiadzie. No. I w końcu ojciec przychodzi, no zmieniłem zdanie. Już nie jedziemy do Ameryki. A ja już trochę po angielsku mówiłam, starałam się, żeby jak najszybciej znać dobrze angielski. No, nie jedziemy do Ameryki, jedziemy do Polski.
Yeah, I believe I can start. Thank you very much I'm really glad that we can get together and have this first webinar. I'm very happy. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Robert, John. I was thinking how to start this little commentary to what we have just heard, which is a clip from our Witnesses to the Age Great Digitalization and Video Making Program. But we have here Leonarda Kielar, who starts her story in Nürtingen in southeastern Germany, not very far from Stuttgart, when there is a network of 17 forced labor camps for Eastern workers mostly, contributing to German war production. And I was wondering when to start talking about this particular experience, and I thought, shall I start before or after, or just in the moment of liberation, because liberation is is actually in the center of what we're discussing today. And I thought, let's start with the moment of liberation, because it made me symbolically think in terms of, I think everybody knows that, the Forrest Gump movie. There is this early scene when he is a young boy and he found himself besieged by a group of bullies, and he is wearing some straps and frames on his legs that he cannot run, and he's assisted by his friend, and there's this famous phrase, "Forrest run." They're tossing stones at him, and he's starting to run away, and it begins very, very awkwardly, and then he's speeding up, and then the shackles and all these frames just fall off, and he finds himself running to safely in full speed. And this connected to what I have just heard with Leonarda and all these kids that are actually leaving or going outside the camp, and they're running towards this line of tanks. And the closer they get, the less slaves they are, and the more the regular human beings with their own dignities and as persons, they approach the tanks. And what happened to her is that when she arrives at the very first tank and she meets the commanding officer, we don't know who he was, but they were pretty sure that there were white stars, not red, which she knew very well from before in her life. So at the moment she's invited to actually ride on this tank, she becomes a part of this victorious march. When she is no more a slave, she's actually the one who is liberating the others. She's coming back with her brother back to the camp, but in a completely different form, as a completely different person. And I thought this is a very powerful experience, because the question comes, what she was liberated from. And she was liberated from being a cog in Hitler's new European order. And her life illustrated a typical fate of a Polish citizen after September 1939, which was the moment of Soviet and Nazi collaboration. She lived in Eastern Poland, so she escaped from the Soviets because, lest her father would be executed or deported. Then her state, which is Poland, was destroyed and replaced by a system of organized lawlessness and crime, and she becomes a part of 2.5 million Polish workers that are simply transferred to Germany to help the German economy to bear the war effort, actually, to fight the war. And she's also a lost generation in a sense, because for years she's deprived of schooling, education, and a compassionate upbringing. And practically speaking, she's a slave doing an unpaid and unregulated work. And when those white stars show up at the horizon just out of the forest, she's going to be a different person. She's not going to be anymore what she was. And what she becomes is extraordinary, because this is a period of contrasts to the past. She thinks about food. Food is something that she keeps repeating also in other parts of the video. She finds happiness. She's so excited about the Americans all around her, and she makes friends with them. Her brother makes friends with them. And these soldiers are, I think to a certain degree, they're most probably idealized, because they are those who actually change her life. And she established friendships. She also finds herself for the first time for years in a privileged position. She can pick up flowers. The Germans are not, because they're chased away by the American soldiers. That's what she tells at some point. She walks into the field and she collects flowers, and then Americans approaching, and she says, "No, I'm a Pole, not a German." And they say, "Okay, then pick up more. Take more." She's building her life, planning, learning English. She's dreaming about migrating to the United States. She's now personally responsible for her future. And finally, she shares fear to give up all the opportunities to embrace life in communist Poland. And that's perhaps a part that we can come back later. Thank you.
Okay, let us continue then with the American clips.
It was that spring day in April when I walked through those gates, and I saw in front of me what I now call the walking dead. I saw human beings that had been beaten and starved and tortured and so maltreated. I just couldn't understand it. There they stood in front of me. I backed up and I said to myself, my God, what is all this insanity? Who are these people? What have they done that was so terrible that would cause anyone to treat them like this? And I knew on this day that I had seen the face of evil.
In the afternoon, it must have been around 3 o'clock, all of a sudden we see the door opens. It's we see an American soldier. He must have been a young man, maybe 20, maybe 22, heavy set, with a big helmet. He comes in, he looks at us, and he starts crying. He cries. One of our boys, I don't know how, but he comes out and starts singing Yankee Doodle Dandy. And we all join in. We don't know the words, we don't know the music, but he starts singing Yankee Doodle Dandy, and we all start singing Yankee Doodle Dandy. And as soon as the first American soldier comes in, there is a whole battalion of American soldiers. We are standing there singing Yankee Doodle Dandy without knowing the words. And they stand and cry. They look at us and they cry. I mean, battled, hardened soldiers. Men that probably were in the Battle of the Bulge or wherever they were fighting. They stand, they look at us and cry. And we stand there, cry with them and sing Yankee Doodle Dandy. That scene is something which I'll never forget. I mean, it is like saying, what took you so long? Where were you?
I think I'll start because the two went in the order of Leon Bass and then Max Durst, and then I'll have my colleague Nick Mueller pick up from there. I was really fascinated with the clip that Wojciech showed and commented upon about a woman who had a fairly decent life until the tides of history washed over her, first from one direction and then the other, and she became really a kind of had a migration on the path of terror, and eventually was saved by the arrival of U.S. tanks. You know, Leon Bass never had a life that we would call worthy of human dignity, at least not as an African American growing up in his time and place. He was a man who knew racism, who knew discrimination, who knew marginalization merely by the color of his skin. We talk here at the National World War II Museum a great deal about this campaign for double victory that African Americans talked about during the war. The phrase was first coined by an African American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, but it became a kind of a slogan for African Americans in the course of the war, that there were two wars being fought, and thus there were two victories being sought. And the one victory, of course, was over the foreign enemy and what Leon would later call the face of evil, the foreign enemy being fascism, militarism, dictatorship. But then there was also the internal struggle that had to be fought, that World War II, if we were victorious in America, had to result in a better and society, a more just society, a more egalitarian society. If you were an African American living in the South, our museum is located in New Orleans, about as far south as you can get in America. If you were an African-American growing up in the South, German prisoners of war who would be brought to places like Louisiana or brought to the neighboring state of Texas had all sorts of rights that you did not have as an African-American citizen. To enter a restaurant, to ride public accommodations, to do any manner of things. Of course, the German POW had the admission ticket into American society. He had white skin, no matter what the obnoxious nature of the cause for which he was fighting or the heinous crimes he had committed. He was a white, and that meant status in not only in the American South. I don't mean to pick on my own region solely, because it was really true all over the country. So that's the background of Leon Bass. One of our founder, you've heard Nick Mueller introduced as one of the founders of the museum. The other, of course, is Nick's very good friend at the University of New Orleans, Dr. Stephen Ambrose. And Stephen Ambrose famously said that the United States fought a war against the greatest racist in history. That, of course, would be Adolf Hitler. But the irony of it is we did so with a segregated army in which there was seen to be something inherently wrong with that, blacks and whites mingling together in the same space or doing the same jobs or benefiting from the same from the same liberties. So I think Leon Bass, I don't think we're going too far to say he intrinsically identified with the victims that he saw. He saw them being beaten, starved, tortured. I'm quoting from his own oral history. What is this insanity, he said? What have they done that earned such treatment? And I think while he is obviously talking about the inmates, if you will, the tortured at Buchenwald, I think we have to read that clip in the light of his own experience as an African-American male and growing up in the United States of America. And I think, what is this insanity? You could say, as we look at what the Nazis had wrought in Europe, but perhaps Americans can also look around at themselves and the racism of the day and that persists into our own day and say, what is this insanity? But Leon Bass, that day changed him forever, as we saw in the clip. He went on to be an educator. He attended university, a PhD from Temple University. He taught at many schools. But I think the most important thing that Leon Bass did when he came back is testify, not only to what he had seen in the Holocaust writ large, but testified in a specifically American context to the evil and insanity of racism. Thanks. Nick?
So, yes, well, first, Wojciech and John, let me just thank you all for hosting this event, a partnership that we began to think about between the National World War II Museum and the Pilecki Institute some 15 months ago with Dr. Alex Ritchie. And so it's wonderful to see this come to fruition. And these very powerful three testimonies give an insight into what you as a research institute and what we as a national museum on World War II are attempting to do in different ways. But these stories certainly join us together in a common quest. And I think that's a wonderful contribution that we can make across the ocean and across the last 75 years. Just a word for our audience, the National D-Day Museum was founded 30 years ago in ideas like these that brought Steve Ambrose and I together. And 10 years later, we opened the National D-Day Museum. And that grew into, by demands of Congress and others and World War II veterans, into the expanded mission to tell the story of all of World War II, which was a daunting task for a couple of historians. You can imagine it was not mandated by Congress at that time and when we began. But the mission now is to tell the story of the American experience in World War II and why the war was fought, try to help visitors understand that and how it was won and what it means today. And what it means today is what brings us to the subject of our panel. And because what it means today has to do with the legacy and the meaning of the war. So for future generations or this generation, what did it mean after all to have lost some 65 million people in the course of that conflict? And how do we as Americans try to extract the meaning and the legacy of that war. And I should say that the D-Day Museum and the World War II Museum is founded, as the Pilecki Institute is, fundamentally on Steve Ambrose's original 1,200 personal eyewitness accounts of veterans of D-Day. And now we have some 10,000 oral histories of veterans of the war and every theater of the war, the Pacific and Europe. So we do have in this last pavilion, the Liberation Pavilion, which is coming out of the ground right now as we speak. It is that part of our mission that talks about what it means today. And for our museum, it's important, as those two testimonies would suggest, from Leon Bass and Max Durst, is for us, it's how Americans encountered the moment of liberation at the end of the war. And it means something different from the American side than, of course, the experience in Poland and Eastern Europe. So we are focusing on the moment of liberation from both the veterans, the soldiers who opened those camps, and the survivors. And the Max Durst story is one of the most compelling. I mean, when I saw that first in 2002 at the Shoah Foundation out in California, I mean, it just brought me to my knees, and it still does every time I see it, how he felt and what it meant to him at that very moment, singing Yankee Doodle Dandy while the American soldiers are standing there just crying in front of him. And that's the emotional source of our narrative in the Liberation Pavilion. And his final words, "What took you so long? What took you so long?"
I would just like to toss in, Nick, if you don't mind, with a shout out and a thank you to our good friends at the Shoah Foundation for allowing us to use that in this program.
So, I mean, we understand that that we do not treat as the experiences on the Eastern Front and the Polish experience, but we are trying to understand the public memory of the United States as we experience the war, and that is the approach of the narrative of our museum and the foundation of our post-war memory, where our museum takes position that the great legacies of the war for not just America, but in fact the world in a way was transformed by our commitment as emerging as the leader of what we used to describe as the free world. Our commitment to freedom and to democracy and to human rights. If you try to say, what does it mean today? We think those are the big takeaways from World War II today. And they will remain the big takeaways 100 years from now or 200 years from now. And the rule of law. And so Max Durst conveys that joy of freedom and liberation gained, and the freedom from fear, which Roosevelt talked about before the war. The four freedoms were animated his foreign policy and his war aims. And then after the war, you have the United Nations and Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I saw at your Solidarity Museum, still has a very powerful impression and influence behind the Iron Curtain in those years. And so we want to commemorate that too in the Liberation Pavilion, so that our visitors will understand what those survivors and liberators felt at the moment, and hopefully get our visitors into that moment.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank all three of you for wonderful commentaries and very, very moving clips. I thought maybe we could begin just by talking a little bit about the effect that the discovery of the camps had. For the American and British publics, it came as quite a shock to discover the camps. and to see this horror. And it was something that they had not really understood or realized before that. So what kind of effect did we've seen the effect personally on soldiers who released them, but what about the publics back home? And how did the discovery of the horrors of the camps change our perspective of the war and what it was about?
I'll start if
Sure.
you don't mind. Well, I think the simple answer, John, to your question is it changed it profoundly. It changed our view of the war and what the war had been about. It was perhaps easy while World War II was being fought to say, oh, this is just a new version of World War I. And World War I was a new version of the wars of national liberation in the 19th century, of the Napoleonic Wars, that war is war and war is hell, and it's all very, very bad. Country X versus country Z, let us say, duking it out over a few border provinces. You had a conqueror, and that had happened, would-be conqueror of the world, as we said, Adolf Hitler, but that had happened before in the manner of a Napoleon or a Philip II, or go all the way back to Genghis Khan, choose your conqueror. But I think World War II was, the image of World War II was changed forever and profoundly by the discovery of the camps. Dr. Mueller has already been talking about the Liberation Pavilion we're building. And one of the galleries in the Liberation Pavilion will be entitled "And Then They Came for Me." We'll be looking at the Holocaust. Now, you might say, why is that in the Liberation Pavilion? Does that obviously, and we know temporally, it belongs in the middle of the war. So the war fighting. But when it became a part of, let us say, the shared consciousness of most Americans, our museum does talk about the American view and the American experience in World War II. When it became a part of our shared consciousness as Americans was really in the post-war world. It would take a while, though. I would say, as a matter of fact, the more I think about your question, which is a good one, I say it's still being worked out. I think there was a general sense through the Nuremberg trials. I think there was a kind of forgetfulness then. I think the appearance of Elie Wiesel's Night or the dramatization of the Diary of Anne Frank in both Broadway and Hollywood versions. But again, I think in terms of scholarship, the way World War II history is written today is completely different than it was even 20 or 25 years ago. The Holocaust has become foregrounded, and the military struggle, about which numerous books have been written, and I plead guilty to having done that myself. The military struggle kind of takes a bit of background, that is, takes a back seat to Hitler's racism and to the horrors of the Shoah, the horrors of the camps. Stalingrad gives way to Auschwitz, I guess, is one way I might put it. And that's been, if you study the historiography, at least of World War II, that's been the principal development in, I would say, the last 25 or 30 years, really coming out of a memory war in Germany about just how Germans should look back at World War II, and then becoming, I think, the general property of Western scholars. So that's my relatively long-winded answer, but the short answer is it changed it profoundly.
But as you say, it did take a long time.
I would agree with that. I would say, though, to go back to your question, and Rob kind of moved in that direction as well, I don't think the discovery of the camps of the Holocaust immediately after the war had as big as impact as it perhaps did in Poland, where you're closer to Auschwitz. And you have to remember that for Americans, the end of the war and the joy of liberation and VE Day and then VJ Day kind of overwhelmed everything. Our boys are coming home, and on the one hand, and so until the Nuremberg trials got rolling, I mean, there was a definite shock for those on the ground, the troops that encountered those camps, just like Leon Bass. And there are many other stories of just a tremendous shock of how anybody could do this to human beings. I mean, this terrific organized murder on such a scale that was definitely a shock to Eisenhower, to the generals, and of course famous photographs of him making everybody come in, and cameramen and the press taking pictures so that nobody will ever forget it, because he said somebody will try to say it didn't happen if we don't record it. So there was that at the beginning, but then that got overwhelmed, I think, in public memory until Nuremberg trial started. And then, as Rob said, the Anne Frank story in the 50s started gaining some traction with the young people and everyone really around in our country. But it was really, I think, wouldn't you say, Rob? I think the documentaries in the 70s that also came to Europe on television that had really opened people's minds. So Nuremberg and then Anne Frank and then the documentaries began to change public memory and America's experience of the Holocaust. And it became part of the public narrative as a justification or a legitimization of why we fought. We were training our troops with war films. War training films to say we were fighting fascists and we were fighting against evil. We were training our people to think that. But you have many World War II veterans said until we got to the camps, we didn't really know. We thought we were fighting Germans. But when we got to the camps, we knew why we were fighting. So that is part of the public memory that has moved into the narrative, the public narrative. And it's frankly, too, what Steve Ambrose felt and wrote about in his books. So the camps and the Holocaust become, in a way, a symbol of what we were against and what we remain against in terms of fighting extremist ideologies of fascism or communism on either extremes. And that we have to be vigilant. If a lesson, we don't tell people that. We hope they appreciate it from going through our exhibits. Because in the post-war era, there hasn't been another world war. So we've done better than between World War I and World War II. Perhaps not perfectly, but World War II is held in memory, I think, by this museum as a struggle of freedom and democracy against authoritarian racist regimes and ideologies. And we have to be vigilant to protect against that.
Maybe let me just take a little different approach to your question. I mean, I think it's a quite of complementary here, because basically from what we hear about the response and reaction among the American soldiers opening the camps and witnessing what they have seen, this actually brings me to the core of our meeting, that is the power of witness. Because of course, and that's part of our research at the Institute, that we're trying to pursue an agenda in research about what the Polish government in exile and what the Polish agencies on the ground here in occupied Poland were doing for about informing the entire world about what was going on in German camps. One of the examples is the collection held by the United Nations War Crime Commission, in which you can find files put together definitely by Polish intelligence about death camps in Treblinka and others, where you can have, where you find plans, descriptions of the crew and what sort of atrocities have been done there, including information that the floor in gas chambers were wet, which means somebody who noticed that had to deliver that message outside the camp, and it then was taken further into the world. So I'm saying this for one particular reason, that we're trying to understand how much it was already known at the level of governments and also in the public, even in the public. I mean, there were reports found in magazines, in newspapers, but it doesn't really matter as long as you have people like Leon Bias just entering the camp and seeing it with their own eyes. And the whole idea that we are trying to work with witness accounts, and this includes oral history, video recordings, and also what we are basically doing, that is collecting the sworn testimonies given by witnesses of German crimes throughout Poland that were given right after the war and later on, and they're in a written form. I think this is a game changer in the sense that it's not enough to have a report. It's not enough to have a description, even made by a very talented and skilled journalist. You have a witness, and what he saw, it's very difficult to deny. You mentioned, Nick, about that you know, as long as you have witnesses, then nobody can deny what happened. And this is partially so important also in the Polish context, when we want to go beyond just general understanding that all the atrocities that happened that were caused by the Germans happened in the camps. Well, they happened outside the camps as well, and we have witnesses about that too. And this is one of the reasons why our institute puts so much emphasis on bringing to the light witness accounts of different sorts and of different origins.
If I may say, it's a curious thing that there was so much information known by the Allied governments about the camps, about the atrocities that were going on.
There was.
And yet they were very reluctant to let any of that out, to inform the public of what was going on. They felt that people simply would not believe it. And of course, there are the stories of Jan Karski talking in Washington, and his interlocutor saying, I can't believe what you're saying. Well, he's not a liar. I'm not saying he's a liar. I'm saying that I cannot believe what he's saying. And so is there, to some extent, is there something about how it's just impossible to understand, to believe this until you actually enter the camp yourself and see it with your own eyes? I think that's correct.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what Wojciech is saying is the power of the eyewitness, that personal testimony, is so authentic that you stand in before it, and you have to accept it. This is the personal story, and that's why we think it's so wonderful what you are doing to preserve those stories in such volume with such professional methodologies. And ours, by contrast, were gathered over years and cover the whole war, and yours are very focused and are focused on the violence that's done to innocent people. That is a part of World War II that has to be preserved and sustained forever, because that could happen again, and those eyewitness testimonies are the greatest defense against that. And as a rabbi here recently, Stephen Lehren, who's written a book, and he was on television, and he says in his own words, and he comes from families who were survivors, and he says, when they tell you they're coming for you, believe them. And again, it's that personal voice that is so powerful and so compelling. And then when you hear something like that in the context of an eyewitness who survived and then tells you of what happened and how it happened, those things need to be preserved at all costs on both sides of the ocean.
John, I'll bring the voice of the perpetrator in here for a moment. SS guards regularly said to inmates in the camps, no one's going to believe you. Even if somehow you escape this, no one's going to believe that this actually happened. And we're not only going to eventually kill you, but the memory will be gone. And I think that those kinds of comments, which Elie Wiesel talked about his whole life, Primo Levi talked about in all his written work, I think those kind of comments really underlie what our museum does, what the Pilecki Institute does, what really any memory-based institution does, is just try to give voice to these people who were told, your physical existence will be snuffed out, your very memory will be snuffed out. No one will ever know this even happen. Perhaps the most depressing thing you could hear, no matter what situation you're in.
Do you think that this changes anything about how we look at other genocides, other conflicts that are going on since the Second World War?
I mean, if just for a brief moment, coming back to this issue of eyewitness, and you're absolutely in full agreement with Rob regarding the fact that you have to be heard, and that's why public memory is very much based on one way or another playing with or using eyewitness accounts to actually deliver the message, to forward the message to next generations. But interestingly, from the Polish perspective, if I might say that way, there's one more thing that perhaps it's overlooked by general audience. That is, it is true that we are collecting witness accounts that were placed right after the war and then across decades. And that's true that they are now available, and some of them you can see at chroniclesofterror.pl on our website, and many of them are already translated into English. It's all true, but the thing is, they were collected for a very important reason: to actually put on trial the criminals, the war criminals, and the overwhelming majority of that witness accounts were never used for that reason. And here in Europe, here in Poland, it's a very painful aspect of the memory about the Second World War, because these eyewitness accounts were not only to just recall what happened. They can be used for that reason right now, but they were also an expressions of great trauma. And in a sense, we can say that because they go in thousands. And here we believe that when we talk about the Polish nation that was afflicted by the atrocities, both by the Nazis and by the Soviets, we think that what happened to the nation was it generally got traumatized. And these witness accounts were supposed to be also a powerful tool to bring back the justice. I mean, to put things back on their legs, on their feet, because what Germans did in Poland was to actually, as I mentioned before, to introduce some sort of organized crime that you punish for things that in the States you will be rewarded, but here you're punished for that. And people lived through that sort of life for a long time. And then an act of reconciliation, any form of reckoning was extra important. And these accounts were supposed to help out with that. It didn't work. And now what we are left with is mostly to preserve it for the memory so that we can remember what happened and draw conclusions and write this history, because that's the way we can actually honor the memory of these people and, well, of our recent past, in a sense.
Yeah, I might add, I was struck, as Nick was, by that when Max Durst said, "What took you so long?" And as you were saying, Rob, it took decades for any of this to come out. Primo Levi Wiesel were not listened to at all. Primo Levi could not get his book published. Why does it seem to take so long before people are able to look back and see the horror for what it was? And is there any chance that that will change, that we'll see things for what they are?
John, if I might, I think I do need to interject maybe at least a bit of a tone of disillusionment on my own part, because we're talking about the Holocaust has come out, it's well known, and of course, we're all educated people here, and we know that the Holocaust occurred, and we just something of its contours. But you know, there's a great deal of research and public opinion polling in the United States of young people who have not the slightest idea of exactly what we mean when we say Holocaust. I mean, I think our museum, and maybe all museums, are working under two kinds of time pressure. For us, the passing away of the cohort that fought World War II is going to require a fundamental shift in our priorities and our self-image and in our activities. But we're also, fighting that battle against the loss of historical memory in general. World War II ended roughly 75 years ago today. When I was a child growing up, I was born in 1958 in Cleveland, Ohio, in the United States. There was a war that was 75 years old, and it was the Spanish-American War. And I can tell you that, we didn't really talk about it all that much. There are a handful of episodes. Teddy Roosevelt, Rough Riders, San Juan Hill. I think I'm done. That was probably what we knew about the Spanish-American War. Now, I don't think World War II will ever quite be consigned to that box in the historical, memory museum. But it's 75 years is a long time in our society, drenched in media and current impressions and always seeking something new. And that's the one thing that I think we also need to talk about. There may be a scholarly community that says, of course, the Holocaust. The broader public may be in danger, at least again, if some of these articles and polls that I see have any veracity at all. There may be some danger that we're losing that today, particularly, I would say, amongst young people. I don't always want to pick on young people. They're doing wonderful things, but it's just the society they live in. Henry Ford said, history is bunk. Unfortunately, Americans seem to have kind of internalized that over the years. I'll just say that.
And I would say that, unfortunately, on the one hand, it's fortunate that we've gone 75 years without a world war. Unfortunately, war, the absence of war, you begin to forget why wars happen. And in this case, one of the most violent periods in all of human history, as Rob says, begins to fade from memory. And people can't even remember if it took place, young people in this century or last century or the 19th century. So the education is a challenge, and museums and research centers can't do it alone. And that's why these kinds of programs are so vital. And racism runs deep in Western societies and in Asian societies for centuries. So, and extremism and violence and organized murder in the name of religion or race has happened before in other parts of the world, but never on the scale. I think that's the scale of this thing, which was so horrific, of the Shoah, that has had such a deep and penetrating influence. And it's our job to try to preserve the memory of that on a especially from the point of view of the individuals who were witnesses to it. We're not a Holocaust museum. We talk about the course of the war, and we talk about the Holocaust in the context of the war, in the end of the war. And yes, it's pretty well established that our leaders knew more or less the terrible things were happening, but as Wojciech said, how can you believe something going on that scale? There was sort of a built-in skepticism about it. It couldn't be as bad as it was, and that was a big shock to our generals and soldiers when they encountered it. But is there hope for the future? I think we can see that we have to be vigilant. We always say here at this museum, when we talk about liberation, that freedom is always under pressure. It's always under pressure, and we have to be vigilant. And the testimonies of our witness accounts who can shock us into appreciating where extremism can lead to. And the consequences it can have for individual liberty and loss of life in an arbitrary way, and to innocent civilians. They can tell that story or witness to that story better than a museum, more effectively than a museum. But how we get that out to our policymakers and politicians and young people in our schools, that's a challenge.
I think I actually very much appreciate the fact that you're talking about, I mean, and your museum is basically focused on the course of the war, and your all our oral histories are, as far as I understand, they're made of the eyewitness accounts coming from the fighters, from soldiers, from American troops, which brings me to an understanding that despite the fact that in the public memory, whenever you mention World War II, the Holocaust pops up right away, and that's what happened with our conversation right now. But in the fact, I mean, World War II is, if I may put it that way, it's just far bigger than that. I mean, it's so many other things that were happening, and so many other nations also under extreme pressure. And what is interesting here is, because this brings me back to Leonarda Kielar, so our first witness that whom we watched, and you mentioned that freedom is always under pressure, with something we have to fight for and sort of look after it so that we don't lose it. And in her story, this is amazing, because she is with the decision, you may remember how the clip is ended. She says, we're not going to the US, we're going back to Poland. And from other parts of her testimony, I know that this was a very big discussion within her own family, because she and her brother, they were so eager to travel away. I mean, he, in the meantime, in one of the camps after the war for the displaced persons, he met a widow who had family in Argentina, and he fell in love, and he wanted to travel with her and establish his household over there. And she wanted to go to New York. And then her father decided to return to Poland, knowing very well what it meant to meet communist regime. I mean, he fled the communists in 1939, but and that's what she says in their story. She says, we tried to convince our father, but he responded, I have fought for Poland so many years. He was, during the First World War, he was a Polish legionnaire, and he is among those, so about these people who are very much contributing to regaining independence after 123 years of partitions. So coming back to him, he said, I fought for Poland so much, I have to come back. It doesn't make sense. I don't want to go to Argentina, where I don't know the language. I don't want to go to the United States, where I don't know the language, and I don't want to sweep streets. I have to go back to Poland. And they all followed him. And the most striking thing is, he died within 12 months in Poland. Why? Because once he showed up there, the secret police started harassing him, calling him like every day for different types of questioning. Interrogations, exactly. So that's what, and his heart didn't just take it. Within 12 months, he was gone. And her brother tried to escape once from that Poland. He was caught. He was put to prison for 2 years. He was he left the prison, and within a few months he died. Heart attack. Her daughter died by just jumping into the river, and her mother soon also died out of exhaustion, meaning her body was completely exhausted after years of malnutrition and everything that you want to have. She was left alone. And that was the pride. I mean, the moment that she decided to follow her father, also so much weight into the future that she stepped into. She never traveled to the United States. And as a symbol for that was the moment that they were returning home from Germany to the Polish border. And guess what? They were returning in an American car that was presented by one of their American friends to them to travel back home. they made only to the Polish border, and then the car was confiscated. Most of their belongings were taken away. They were only allowed to take 2 suitcases and get on the train and get back to Poland, after supervised by the Soviets. That's why the freedom is always under pressure. That's why these stories had to be heard from the beginning to the end to have the idea what happened and what sort of challenges these people faced.
I agree.
Okay, we are at the hour, so I think we should probably start to take some questions, perhaps. I have one question, I think the one at the bottom of the list here. How can I continue to honor these memories and share this knowledge with young school children I teach? Do you want to talk a little bit about educational outreach programs that we have in our institutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say a few words. I'm very proud to work at the National World War II Museum for many reasons, but one of the reasons is the moment Nick and Stephen Ambrose founded this museum, they saw it as an educational institution. And we have a series of K through 12, kindergarten through 12 programs that the museum stages for young children all the way up to teenagers in their high school years. We provide high school teachers with a curriculum that we've worked out and vetted and curated very, very carefully. We think it's a top-notch curriculum, lesson plans, everything that a high school teacher, for example, would need to teach sections on the Holocaust or World War II or Hitler's foreign policy or what have you, whatever we think is important in World War II. I am currently also the head of our Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, which we feel is, we envision as having that foot in the higher education camp too. So I would urge everyone out there who's listening, if you have any knowledge, personal experience, artifacts, documents that you think would be enlightening, and in particular enlightening to young people, that you approach your nearest museum, or perhaps contact us, or if you're in Central or East Central Europe, contact Wojciech and get in touch and see if you can put those artifacts or documents or memories to good use in the educational mission.
And I would say that we have a teacher institutes that we run every summer for teachers from across the country. We used to be able to subsidize and pay for those teachers to come in for a 1-week intensive learning with the curriculum materials, but we've also invested almost $20 million in building the Hall of Democracy with a library and media platforms, a World War II Media and Education Center that's just sort of getting up and running to do what you all are doing. You're posting so many of your, Wojciech, your transcriptions and your stories online, and you're way ahead of us. We only have about 700 or 800 of curated oral histories out of 10,000. Those can be downloaded from you and from us by teachers and everywhere. And our goal with the Media Center, which has production studios and electronic classrooms, is the museum is not enough by itself. We have to think beyond the walls of the museum and be able to take the stories globally. But to all teachers out there and parents, or just tell the stories and get the stories and pass them on. It's all about the stories and preserving them. Authentic stories is at the bedrock of what we do.
I would just add quickly that also in our case, we have a good number of materials available to the Polish teachers, but we're also reaching out to international audience. We run international teacher education program once a year, and similar in idea to what Nick Mueller just mentioned. We're also running for the American and Canadian students a program called the Pilecki Project, which you can find more about on our website or on our social media. So we are trying to also to get a greater offer to international audience about whatever we're doing and about the materials, the wonderful materials we've got. We're very happy to share them. We're happy to work with you. So just let us know.
I want to add one other question, or not question, a statement though, about this. And this program is an example of bringing different perspectives of the war and how it affected us both in terms of policies and as human beings. And this September, Wojciech and others from different nationalities around the world are coming to look at together at a conference called Memory Wars, and how different national perspectives are looked at together by historians and museum leaders and by Wojciech and people like that. I think it benefits all of us to begin to understand World War II in a global context, because every nation has different impacts and different legacies, and the war has different meaning for them. And we gain from each other as we talk about the struggles and those different perspectives.
Okay, I have another question. There's many questions. I'm afraid I will not be able to cover many of them. But one question here is, I have read that some Americans were in POW camps that were almost as horrific as the concentration camps. Any comments on that? And I thought we have been perhaps a bit loose in talking about camps in a very general way, because it was a very large, complex system. And we haven't talked, for instance, really about the extermination camps, the death camps that were set up in the eastern parts of Poland, and Auschwitz itself, of course. But maybe it's worth talking a little bit about to differentiate between the kinds of camps and conditions that we're talking about.
Sure, I'll give a brief intro to that. I think probably I'm the most suitable person. Nazi Germany was a police state. It was dedicated to the art of incarcerating human beings in all sorts of different ways and for all sorts of different reasons, and utilizing different methodologies. So the original camp system in Nazi Germany were set up for communists and enemies of or perceived enemies of the regime very early on in the Nazi regime. That is Hitler's takeover of power, so-called, in late January, and within months. There were camps, most famously at Dachau near Munich, for his political enemies. That system never died. Those always existed. There were then a gigantic system of prisoner of war camps for once the war broke out, and then of course there were this incredible series, and it's almost infernal. It's almost difficult to describe in any terms other than those of morality. This infernal system of annihilation, or so-called death camps in Central and Eastern Europe. Auschwitz is a pretty good example in that it was originally originally Polish barracks, and then originally a camp under German occupation for Polish prisoners of war, and then a gigantic facility for making synthetic rubber that never produced an ounce of synthetic rubber, and then attached to it a gigantic death facility. So the U.S. Holocaust and Memorial Museum has put out a multi-volume series on these various incarceration and camp sites of the Holocaust. And once again, I'll just say that if there was ever a state that brought the art of incarceration to a finely honed perfection, it was Nazi Germany. Let me address the POW question. The actual question was asked very quick, if my partners don't mind. I would hesitate to say there were POW camps that ever approached the death camps, because POWs were not being systematically slaughtered. There probably were POW camps that came to resemble concentration camps, in that if you had a particularly cruel commandant or a particularly cruel cohort of SS or SA guards, if you're being beaten, I don't think you say, well, this is a prisoner of war camp. It's not a concentration camp. If you're being beaten or systematically starved or abused, or there's no heat in the barracks in the middle of the winter. But I think the terror there for the American POW would probably be a bit more haphazard and dependent upon individual circumstances, like something like the kind of commandant that you happen to get assigned with. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And of course, Dachau and so many of those other camps began for political prisoners. The camps, the POW camps in Japan, were much rougher in terms of torture and beatings and starvation than in Nazi Germany. So it depends on what kind of where the POW camps are and which nation. And of course, the Germans notoriously took better care of the officers than they did everyone else. And we have stories of one story, Glenn Jostad. We were just Rob and I were talking about him the other day, and he was being transported to Moosburg from from another camp in northern Germany, Muesberg, near Munich, and was being literally carried by his fellow veterans, and thought that the day he was liberated was going to be his last day alive. And so he was part of that long march of POWs. So, but you do have to differentiate when you talk about the camps and even the internment camps in China. We have some liberation stories there, which are equally wonderful and joyous, and where they felt the breath of freedom with the airborne troops dropping out of the air to liberate the internment camps, which were not anything like concentration camps or the death camps.
Let me just add one point to that, because you're absolutely right that POW camps should be differentiated also in terms of racial ideology that the Nazi Germany followed. I mean, the Western countries and people there were actually and happily used by the Germans to exchange for the German prisoners. Whereas in the East, and this is particularly the case of the Soviet prisoners of war, who died in millions after 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, because the POWs there were the camps were established only to keep their people there and make almost no use. That means they were just left there with no water and no food, and they're just simply starved to death. And that's a completely different approach that we can see in the Western countries. And additional just remark that we learn also from our patron, Witold Pilecki, who was a volunteer to Auschwitz, to the Auschwitz camp. What we learned from him is that the first gassing trials, I mean, the ways how to kill many people in one time in a small area, was actually performed by the Germans on the Soviet prisoners of war.
I'm glad you brought that into the discussion, Wojciech. If you hadn't, I wanted to enter it as well. We really do need to differentiate between the German war in the West and the German war in the East.
Yeah, and also I think to highlight in the kind of hierarchy of camps, that at the very bottom were the death camps and the camps like Auschwitz that served both purposes. And Auschwitz was a horrible place for Polish political prisoners, and many died there. They were supposed to die there. They were told when they came, you will never leave here except through the chimney. But still, at the end of the war, 97% of those who died in Auschwitz were Jews, yes. Jews that had been sent through the gas chambers. So there's a certain hierarchy of camps, and certainly at the very bottom were the death camps.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that I think we finished our time now, and we'll have to close for now. But we hope that everybody who has come to listen to this will come once again to our next webinar. And I'd like to thank the three of you for helping, for speaking, and for your wonderful commentary.
We'd like to thank you, John and Wojciech, for your leadership and continuing suggestions of doing more things together like this. And we look forward to the next two webinars. I know Rob and I are very, very excited about it, but we kind of exist for these kinds of exchanges. And we are in the memory business, I guess, all of us. We are the memory, and I'd say all of those in our audience today have responsibility for what they learn and responsibility for those memories that we think are so important, not only to the present but to the future.
So we're inviting you for the part 2, which is already scheduled for March 23rd, and we're going to talk about witnessing the outbreak. So we still remain within the business of memory, as you said. We're talking about witness accounts, but this time we're going to talk about the outbreak of war and how it was remembered. And I believe this is going to be as fascinating, if not more, we don't know, as we managed to do it today. We will prepare videos, and I hope to see all of you there. And I'm very grateful that we could have this opportunity to get together and discuss these things across the big lake. Thank you.
I'd like to thank John too. John, this is not easy. Putting all these people together and making sure things move forward. So you did a wonderful job. Thanks.
Thanks. You're very welcome. And I'd like to thank everybody who came and listened to us. And those of you who gave comments and questions, and I'm very sorry we did not get to many of those, but perhaps we may cover them in future webinars as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.